My name is Ethan Zindler. I'm the head of Americas for Bloomberg NEF. We're a research division of Bloomberg.
What do you do and what do you research?
So I focus on trying to understand what's going on in the energy markets across the Americas, specifically as it pertains to the new energy technologies that have come along and are changing how we produce energy, how we consume energy, how we even think about energy in some cases.
So what's changed in the last 20 years in the attitudes of the generators and the utilities that bring the energy to the public?
Good question. So a lot has changed in the last 20 years. First of all, just in terms of the technologies that are available to the generators, and if we're talking about generators, the big generators, the sort of palette of available technologies has widened. In particular, we see renewable energy technologies that are more viable from a cost perspective in the U.S., specifically wind and solar, probably the ones that get the most attention. But we're seeing also some other things like geothermal and biomass in some occasions are also quite cost competitive in the right types of situations. The other big thing that's changed is just the use of natural gas in the U.S. It's just absolutely exploded. And that's taken a lot of shapes and forms, but in the terms of the generators, it's meant a lot more large-scale plants that burn gas, turn turbines, and generate electricity.
And what's happened to coal?
So the coal industry, particularly in the last 10 years, coal as a source of power in the U.S. has gone from about half of all the power that we use in a given year to last year a little more than a quarter. So it's dropped by about half itself. And last year also we saw a very large number of coal plants that announced that they were going to close, the second most that we've actually seen on record. So coal's role in powering our homes and our businesses and other things has really diminished over the last 10 years and is probably going to continue to diminish just simply based on the announcements that we've already seen from companies who say they're going to close.
Politically, we've often heard there's a war on coal. It's an idea that's been thrown out there. Is there a war on coal, or economically it's I
would say if it's a war that's being fought on cost. On cost, natural gas is cheaper and is winning. And on cost, in some cases, renewables are cheaper and they're winning. There's certainly been a number of regulations on the coal industry over the last 10, 20 years. But what's driven the demise of coal-fired power plants has really primarily been that they just have not been able to keep pace with the lower costs that natural gas and in some cases renewables are offering.
So take us into the future. 2030 and 2050 are big years as projected by the IPCC, that the power generation needs to get to about 85% clean to avoid perhaps the worst ravages of climate change. Are we going to get there?
Not unless something changes. We are very optimistic that the kind of changes that we've seen over the last 10 years, that same momentum will continue forward. And you will see a great deal of additional renewable energy that gets added to the grid in the United States. You will see coal-fired generation diminish and not quite disappear, but diminished greatly over the next 10 and 30 years. But if you look at the rate at which we need to decarbonize, we simply are not going to decarbonize as fast as the IPCC says that we need to. And so the technologies are wonderful and they're making enormous progress. And by the way, batteries are going to come along with all of that. But unless you have more aggressive policy making, you don't actually cut CO2 emissions sufficiently from the power sector and from the economy overall to basically have the U.S. make its contributions to reducing CO2 emissions.
So what's the biggest obstacle? Is it financing? Is it consumer demand? Is it government regulation? Is it the will or desires of the power companies? What's standing in the way?
Well, I mean, look, the transition will take place because of economics, and it will happen. The question is, what can you do to accelerate it in some kind of way? And so that requires policy, and that requires collaboration, and there's a lot of political angles on all of that. And frankly, if you want to do something that goes faster than just the way the markets will take you, that has some cost. And so it is understandable that you would have some disagreement about how you get from here to there. But I think a hopeful sign, at least in the U.S., is that we're seeing an increasing number of states that are starting to mandate that renewables be 100% of power generation. California is the most notable one, but New Mexico literally last week passed something along the same lines. Hawaii has set the same goal as well. And then one of the things that was mentioned at our conference earlier today is the utility holding company Xcel, which is based in Colorado and Minneapolis. It has voluntarily pledged to go 100% renewable energy as well, and they operate across 8 different states. So there is a certain kind of bottom-up thing happening policy-wise, but I would argue that it's going to be challenging without real support from the federal government, and right now we definitely do not have that.
What is the pathway for a company to get to 100% renewable? Is that a crazy fantasy, or that's a real economically possible situation?
So for a utility company getting to 100%, let's put it this way. For a utility company to get to 100% zero carbon generation will likely involve, to be clear, a continued role for nuclear power, a continued role for large hydro technology that's been around for a century. It will also require a good deal of wind and solar, and it most importantly maybe will require batteries because you'll need greater flexibility. All those things have to kind of come together and happen. We're quite confident that we'll continue to see declining costs for solar. We've seen incredible momentum over the last 10 years. We think wind prices keep going down, but maybe most importantly, we've seen a great decline in battery prices, and we think that that will continue as well over the next 10 to 20 years, even beyond that as well.
Talk to me about a potential sea change in the attitude, or at least the public-facing attitudes of power companies. I look at many websites over the last few weeks. Their websites look like Greenpeace all of a sudden. There's very little talk of power generation or some of the other things that used to be their most important forward-facing elements. There's a lot of talk of how they're greening their generation. Is that real, or is that PR?
So utility companies, I think, are under pressure from consumers to give consumers the option to buy clean energy if they want to. And so we see a lot of these different options that are being rolled out. Now, giving the consumer the opportunity to pay a premium for the knowledge that the power they have is green is a different thing than the utility opting to shut down its high carbon projects and to just supply with cleaner power. And so I think there is a bit of a difference. It's also worth noting that the way our power markets are set up in the US, that the utility that you and I buy power from every day, they are typically actually just buying power from a different company or a different arm of a company who are on the power generation side. So it is divided up, in fairness to those utility companies, and I think utilities are trying to give consumers more options. But until and unless they simply say, we're not going to buy any coal-fired power generation, it is essentially just trying to create a kind of boutique product for consumers.
Most of these firms are going to have a very nice forward-facing presence. Their lobbying arm, the EEI, has had a very climate denial position for decades. It's updated that a bit recently, although as recently as 2 years ago, the head of that organization was essentially denying climate change on national television. Is there a double game going on?
I would say this, that I think that these are often big organizations, and I think those people who are thinking strategically about how they supply power and how they procure it know the economics and know how things are changing, and I think they have a legitimate understanding and commitment to want to, frankly, buy some of the cheapest power around, which is now, coincidentally, fortunately, often the lowest carbon around. Then there are the sort of, Washington lobbying shops, and they sometimes are under different marching orders or haven't always gotten the memo necessarily about how much things have changed. I would say, though, that I think, to be specific about EEI, I think that they are trailing a little bit behind where many of the utility companies themselves actually are. And similarly, I would say that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which also has not been supportive of addressing climate change, is well behind its membership, or many of its membership, who are making public pronouncements to reduce their CO2 footprints and do things differently, driven to some large degree by consumer demand. So I think there's sometimes things are a little out of sync.
All right, tell us the positive side of the story. Get me excited about new technology, prices dropping. I read last week Germany had 75% clean energy generation just last week, which sounds like a science fiction movie, but it was real. Tell me what's really possible.
Well, what's really possible, and we're seeing already, are countries like Costa Rica and others that are basically 100%, zero carbon energy already. And certainly there are countries that, because they have an enormous amount of large hydro generation, are already, the vast majority of what they produces zero carbon. Countries like Brazil and parts of Canada as well. So, we have parts of the world that on the power generation side is already clean. That's sort of the good news. In the short run. I think the longer term good news and why we feel very positive is that we have seen real progress on these technologies driven by economies of scale. In other words, it's not that I have some sort of magical belief that we're going to have a great breakthrough in some new technology. I just simply know that if you continue to double the amount of solar that's installed, the price falls by a certain percentage. We've seen that over the last 30 years. And with batteries, we've seen battery prices decline already by about 85% over the last 7 or 8 years. That will continue because there is a tremendous amount of new battery manufacturing capacity coming along. There are a number of countries around the world, but most notably China, that see this energy evolution or revolution, whatever you want to call it, as the great economic opportunity of the 21st century, and they are investing and they're adding scale. And so that all bodes very well for prices going forward and makes us feel very positive. And that's not even taking into account like any kind of wacky, technology breakthrough that could happen on some technology that we don't foresee. That's actually, I think, kind of a conservative view that we have about where the world is going. There is the possibility that something else will come along and blow us all away, hopefully, but we'll see.
So when you see something like the Green New Deal being proposed and then being essentially denigrated as an absolute fantasy, just speaking about the energy side of that proposal, there's lots of other things in it. Is it a fantasy, or it might actually be possible?
So I just want to be careful to say that, like, the Green New Deal, the ambition and the boldness of it really deserves to be admired. I mean, and I don't think it's coincidental that something this big and bold came along when we had a whole new wave of people who came into Washington to help push it along. So I think it deserves a lot of credit for that. I also appreciate the fact that they're not shy about saying, hey, climate change is a big problem, a really big problem, and we need a really big solution to go after it. So the kind of ambition of it really deserves to be hailed. It's also worth mentioning that the Green New Deal is being described as like a plan. It's not a plan. It's actually just a set of goals and an outline and a hope that we can create a plan to get there over the next 2 years. Very cleverly, with the understanding that no such legislation will pass until we have a new president and potentially a new Senate, which, of course, the proponents are hoping happens by the time we get to 2021. So what they're trying to do is basically say, hey, we got no time to waste. We got to spend the next 2 years coming up with the best solutions so that, like, on January 20th, 2021, we got a new Congress and a new president. Boom, you can pass this. So that's what they're trying to get at. So they deserve a lot of credit for that. Where I would have taken issue, and others have, including former Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz, is that they at one time said they wanted to basically go to zero carbon from the power sector by 2030. That's not realistic because we've just built so much natural gas over the last 10 years. It will be virtually impossible to take that offline by 2030 and replace it with other sources of generation without it having a very serious cost to the U.S. economy. I think we have to be realistic and practical about that. But there are other areas where we need to reduce CO2 emissions, including from the industrial sector and from the transportation sector. And so those are areas definitely worth focusing on as well.
Tell me about the cost side. So one of the things that people who are afraid of this transition or don't want this transition to occur will often say, it's going to be bloody expensive.
They'll take away your hamburgers.
They might take away your hamburgers.
Yeah, you can't watch TV unless the wind is blowing.
That's right. Those things have been said.
Yeah.
How much of that is real? Is there a real cost, big tax coming for people to be part of this cleaner, greener energy generation?
Look, I mean, we don't think so. Given that if you essentially stay on the, let's put it this way: we think an enormous amount of transition and change will happen anyway, as I said. To accelerate that, I think this, the smartest idea that people have agreed upon is some kind of a price on CO2 emissions, so that the market will sort out a way to take care of this overall. But one of the things that's been talked about is some of the money that's collected from that carbon price or carbon tax gets redistributed to people who are low income as a way to help make sure that they don't feel the full pain of what transition will take place. But yeah, if you want to speed up the transition, it's going to have to cost us something. On the other hand, if we do nothing, the cost societally is going up every year. And it's not, this isn't sort of a figment of my imagination or sort of a theoretical thing. Just look at how much it's going to cost to try and rebuild the grid in Northern California, which big parts of it burned to the ground. How much is it going to cost to rebuild? How much has it cost to rebuild huge parts of Houston that have gone underwater, or parts of North Carolina? Doing nothing is expensive too, so let's not kid ourselves. We can do this in an orderly fashion where we know the costs, or we can sit here and continue to take it on the chin year after year, which is sort of what we're doing right now.
Do you think that people in the industry have soaked in any of the moral aspects of this? If you wake up one day and you've spent a life powering the country, and you take great pride in that you've kept the lights on, and you've kept factories running, and you've kept industry moving, and you wake up one day and find out that your product is in some ways toxic to the planet, or at least to humans living on this planet. Have you seen an internalization of that feeling, and does that create a strong panic to do something quickly? Where are they at?
It's a tough question. I think that, for people who have spent a lifetime in these industries, I don't think, I think in many cases, coming to terms with, thinking that their industry is, essentially helping to cause a global calamity, is not something that they actually, in some cases, can't really do. We had at our conference last year, we had Robert Murray of Murray Energy, which is really the coal company that's really closest to the Trump administration, and this guy's been around coal his whole life. This is everything for him and his family, and it's in his blood, literally. You can't change a person's outlook and life and lifetime of life lessons. Especially with a dry, research report from a bunch of scientists somewhere in Europe. I think there's only so much that you can do. I think to my mind, the more important sort of symbol of change is what we're seeing from the younger people, essentially. And even in some cases, much younger people, like my kids, or that amazing kid over in Sweden who's 13 years old and is, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of children. So I think that's really more where we'll see the change. I think realistically, are we going to change the minds of those who've been entrenched in this industry for decades, and understandably take pride in the fact that the role they played in America's great economic development? I get that. That's fully understandable.
Is there a cool tech component of this? Are people in the industry excited to get their hands on cool new generation technologies, digitizing the grid? That would feel like the fun stuff to work on, where they see it.
Yeah, to my mind, the coolest thing are electric cars. Which is, I know, pretty accessible technology, but, we do all kinds of economic modeling where we say, we think that half the cars that get sold by 2040 are going to be electric vehicles. About a third of the cars on the road are going to be electric vehicles. Others are raising their forecasts as well, but we make those calculations primarily based on the point at which the consumer will decide to buy an electric vehicle, because it is essentially cheaper for them to do on an economic basis. But hey, if you go drive an EV, it's, on a purely qualitative basis, it's just better. The cars are quieter, the acceleration is awesome. They don't break down, generally speaking, because they have a lot less moving parts. The only thing that gets a lot of people hung up on is how far can you drive on them without, recharging them. But on every kind of other way, it's one of those sort of I think anybody who gets behind the wheel of an EV kind of has an aha moment. So for me, that's cool, sexy technology. And, certainly Tesla has helped by designing fantastic looking cars. But, I drive a boxy, nerdy, Nissan Leaf, which I joke is the energy industry analyst's Tesla. And the car performs like a dream, though. It's great. I mean, it has got terrific acceleration. So, to my mind, that's a technology that could capture a lot of people's imagination, which I think would be good because, as I think one of the panelists mentioned earlier today during the conference, electricity that comes into our home is actually fairly undifferentiated. A kilowatt hour is a kilowatt hour. We just want to know that the lights turn on, right? This is technology you can look and feel and use that can change your life in some kind of way.
So is the electric industry looking at a potential giant expansion as essentially all the energy from gas-powered cars turns into the outlet?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really interesting. I sort of was joking the other day that there's a lot of FOMO going on in this industry. So you've got a lot of people worrying that they're going to miss out on the great trend here or there. So utilities are sort of shifting around their business models to try and be involved in rooftop solar because they don't want these little scrappy startups to be the ones who make all the money off of doing that. And meanwhile, some of the oil companies are saying, oh, wait a second, we don't want to lose out to utility companies. The utility companies are saying, just to your point, hey, why should the gas stations be the one providing the energy to go in the car? We got plugs in everyone's house. We should just sell this stuff. So they're moving more in that direction, the smarter utility companies. And then meanwhile, the oil companies, again, they're getting some FOMO and saying, oh, shoot, we don't want to miss out on this. And they're going back the other way. They're buying electric vehicle charging companies. They're investing in utilities. They're getting more. And I think because they recognize that this is a trend that's going to happen. And if it's going to cut into the amount of oil that they're going to be able to sell, well, they might as well then get into selling the juice instead.
So Ralph Izzo was in here earlier talking about efficiency as part of his vision for how we're going to get to a cleaner future. But it strikes me that the opposite of efficiency may be coming to us, where giant spikes in demand will hit these grids.
So we're fairly sanguine about that because of two things. So one, because there's we've seen over time that in the wealthiest countries, the ability to improve energy efficiency is really high. I mean, in the US, we're actually still kind of just getting started. We still have millions of light bulbs, for instance, that need to be swapped out over to compact fluorescent or to LEDs, and that's going to help reduce, just as a simple example. So we overall actually think that if you took away electric vehicles as a factor, that basically demand for electricity in the US would do this, and then it would actually go down as you look out towards 2040, 2050. All that EVs do, in our view, is prevent it from going down and essentially allow it to stay more or less level. So you combine it, greater energy efficiency, but yes, you throw additional demand onto the grid, but it actually just brings you somewhere close to some kind of equilibrium.
So you think there's a balancing act between replacing every old light bulb in the country and giving everyone a new Tesla? Kind of come out even.
Let's start with the light bulbs. We got to replace the refrigerators, and there's a lot of other things that will happen. But as people replace the equipment in their house, these aren't acts necessarily of energy efficiency. These are just I need new stuff, and the new one's much better than the old one. We will continue to see efficiency. We have. I mean, the U.S. Demand for electricity in the U.S. over the last 10 years has not really grown, and we all focus on the fact that we all have 12 different screens that we're operating in our house. But actually, demand for electricity has been flat, and that's actually not great for the utility sector, but it is pretty good for emissions.
Tell us about the tale of different countries developing at different rates, and how some of the world might be cleaning up their act faster than the others.
So there's really, in my mind, essentially countries can fall into sort of three different categories. One, there's the wealthiest nations like ours, who have the economic means to make a difference and change. There are the sort of very rapidly growing countries that are pushing up towards much higher levels of wealth, but are still certainly developing countries, namely India, but also China. And they've added a tremendous amount of coal in the last 5 years, and those countries are going to be very hard to decarbonize going forward. And then there's this very large group of countries that are much less developed. Sub-Saharan African countries, some countries in Southeast Asia, some in Latin America that are middle income. Those countries have a long way to go, and they also, in some cases, have serious energy access issues. We have about 1.5 billion people without really any access to energy at all, and that's one of the great challenges I think we all face. What I'm very hopeful about is that it actually economically, to add energy access for those people, doing so through renewables is actually the cheapest option, mainly because you can do solar on a very distributed basis. If you think about where a lot of those folks live, yes, many of them are in cities, but many of them are far-flung communities. It's just simply cheaper to go out and put a bunch of solar on roofs or to build a mini-grid system and pair it with a battery than it is to build large trunk lines, large transmission lines that go out to those locations. And so as a result, we think that those folks come online primarily through new energy technologies.
Super interested in that idea, this leapfrogging over old energy. And do you think that there's just some massive opportunity in companies going mini grid facilitators in Africa? That's kind of a cool idea.
Yeah, I mean, some of the folks here at our conference, some of the biggest companies that are in either energy equipment providing or energy services providing, like Siemens or Schneider Electric or some of these others, Johnson Controls, they are very interested in being involved in how so-called mini grids evolve. There's also a whole slew of very cool little startup companies that are even on a more basic level will show up and essentially sell you a system that is, a panel about that big, a battery, and some places to plug in your phone or your fan and whatever. And that may not sound like much, but if you've got nothing and you have to walk 1.5 miles to go charge your phone, because most folks now, or many folks in the developing world now, do have phones, but they go and pay $1 or $2 to charge their phone from the local kiosk. These can be life-changing kind of things, and we're seeing more and more of it happen. So that stuff is amazing and very exciting because it obviously addresses two the issues: climate change, but also energy access.
That sounds like a really cool kind of startup to work.
Yeah, those companies are awesome. They're amazing. They're having many of them. There's so many different kind of business models are being tried, and I think one of the challenges is that they have a profit imperative and they're trying to make it work, but they're operating obviously with people who are so at the margins that that you could argue they should be more in the sort of like impact investing or the philanthropic area or whatever. So that finding the right model for how that all works is still being kind of sorted out, but the technology is there, and you can drop a $40 or $50 solar lantern, in somebody's house and really make a big difference.